Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And there's been a lot of shaking and moving in Montpelier this past week. So I'm very glad that regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, one of three reps from Brattleboro, is here to break it all down for us. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Good to be here with you.
Good to be here with you too. You've been so busy lately. Like we kind of catch each other here and there. So I haven't really heard the full lowdown on the override session. It's for those who don't know, of course, the legislature went back this week to Montpelier to vote on some of the bills that the governor had vetoed. And I think you were pretty busy. I was surprised at how many were overturned, how many vetoes were overturned.
So the governor vetoed 8 bills this year. We took up 7 of them.
Okay.
And the House overrode the vetoes on all 7. The Senate was only able to override vetoes on 6 of them, and we can get into the details of that. Okay. But I think I just sort of want to frame up a little bit, like process-wise, just to make sure that we lose some listeners right at the beginning of the show.
Grab your coffee, people.
So, anyone who's going to listen to the happy hour knows how a bill becomes a law. But I just want to remind folks that, before a bill goes to the governor, it is at least voted on and passed by the House and the Senate once. If a bill is even remotely controversial, it usually doesn't come to the House floor unless it's going to have more than 100 votes to pass. That's sort of a 2/3 majority. That's the threshold needed for a veto override. So usually the Senate's not quite as tidy usually, but that's generally how they think about things as well. And for most of the bills that we're talking about here, something leaves the House, it goes to the Senate then amends it, sends it back to the House. Sometimes the House then amends it and sends it back to the Senate. So some of these bills have been debated on and voted out of both chambers 1 time, 2 times, sometimes even 3 times.
Well, and sometimes they've gone through both years of the biennium as well and been worked on in committees and yes, before going to either floor. Yeah.
And so it's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of debate, both in committee and on the House floor before they get to the governor. And so once we receive back vetoes, the path to override is really fairly straightforward. And we tend to not debate at length because people are just want to go back home to their lives at home. It's a fairly quick process. It's generally, when we're on the House floor, there's certainly a point in a controversial debate where most people are like, oh my gosh, everything has been said, just enough already, people. And then people keep on debating after that. If folks
I've been to several select board meetings kind of like that. Yeah.
Yes. Or if folks have gone to representative town meeting, Peter Fish Case always calls the question, often before even people get that feeling. And in the House, you don't call the question. That's not a thing. It just, we debate until the debate is over. And so anyway, so 20 hours of debate could lead up to a veto override that might just involve 2 speeches. There's usually just sort of the speech in favor, the speech against, and then the vote.
And just to put a very fine point on it, what you're basically saying is any bill that goes before the governor has been vetted and vetted and vetted again within an inch of its little policy life.
I want to be I don't know if that's always true, but any controversial bill that's going to the governor has been vetted within an inch of its life. I think there's some housekeeping bills, the captive insurance bill, for instance, is vetted very thoroughly by the Department of Financial Regulation before it gets to the House. But I don't know how many people are paying attention to the nitpicky minutia of the sentences in that 300-page bill.
Mm-hmm.
But like for any of these bills that would get as far as a veto, they have been debated and nitpicked within an inch of their life, yes.
And what were some of the which were the bills that you overrode the veto on?
So there was H-72, which
Mm-hmm.
is harm reduction criminal justice response to drug use.
Right.
That was the pilot overdose prevention center in Burlington, as well as a few other, there's a few other pieces about sort of expanding harm reduction work in there.
Mm-hmm.
H-121, which
Great.
enhanced consumer privacy and age-appropriate design code. That's a data privacy bill.
Yep.
H-289, the renewable energy standard,
Mm-hmm.
which mandates that our power utilities move to renewable energy. H-645, which was expansion, strengthening, resourcing of our restorative justice systems.
Oh,
I was
yes.
shocked by that veto. H-687, just H-687, which is a community resilience and biodiversity protection through land use bill. That's the Act 250 reform bill,
Right.
housing funding bill. Both
Yep.
things were in that bill. H-706, which banned the use of neonicotinoid pesticides. That's the pollinator bill.
Mm-hmm.
Received more emails on that bill than I have maybe anything ever.
Wow.
And H-887, the yield bill. That's the education financing bill.
Yeah. Wow. That's a pretty wide swath.
Yes.
Were there any vetoes? So you mentioned the feeling shocked about the restorative justice bill that was vetoed. I admit that surprised me too. Were there any other bills that the governor vetoed that for you personally were surprising?
I was also surprised, but so H-645, I was surprised because the administration expressed no concerns about it in the lead up in any of the House or Senate work.
Mm-hmm.
And his veto message was that there weren't resources in the bill for the AG's office to do the work, but the AG's office said they had the resources to do the work. So it was a little,
Yeah.
that was just like confusing.
Mm-hmm.
H-706, the one that bans the use of neonicotinoid pesticides, I was surprised about. It was controversial. There were some conventional farmers in a few areas of the state that expressed who are much more aligned with sort of big ag.
Mm.
There's just a couple farmers that sort of are working on that scale in Vermont. And some of the sort of big ag corporate players have concern with it, right? Your
Right.
Monsantos of the world. But I was surprised that the governor vetoed that because he's usually very good at signing the feel-good bills in order to
Mm.
create his constituency, create a balanced view for his constituency.
Mm-hmm.
And so my reaction to that one was like, really? Gov hates the bees? Who would have thought? Right?
Mm-hmm. And I think the bill that at least in community conversations that has gotten the most attention is 887, the education bill, which I know
Mhm.
you and I have been talking about since the December letter in 2023, when the Department of Ed,
It's actually the Department of Taxes that writes
thank
the
you,
bill.
Department of Taxes, sorry
Writes
about
the
that,
letter. Yeah.
you know, issued a warning that, we might be seeing 18% increases. And so I know you've been working on that since at least the end of 2023. Now that everything has kind of sugared off, and I don't know that anyone's really going to be happy given the circumstances. What are you sitting with now? Like, has new information come to light? Are you looking at the situation differently? Um, and oh, before you answer that question, just a clarification question. I know the governor vetoed this bill because he had concerns about affordability, as he stated. However, if we hadn't passed this bill, schools would have had to resort to their previous budget from the fiscal year because they wouldn't have had budgets. So what would have happened if we hadn't had this bill in place?
So if we hadn't had this bill in place, like the risk of vetoing this bill
Mm-hmm.
isn't that we don't have property taxes. What happens when the bill is vetoed, if we don't have a yield bill, that's
Mm-hmm.
what we call it, for once the new fiscal year starts on July 1st, we default to last year's yield bill. We don't default to last year's school budgets. We default to
Oh, okay.
so if an individual school's budget doesn't pass, it defaults to a percentage of the previous year's budget and then
That's what I
borrows.
was
If a
getting
yield
confused
bill
about. Yeah.
doesn't pass, we default to last year's yield bill.
Okay.
What that would look like in the context of the all, but that doesn't mean that spending changes at all because districts have already voted those budgets and agreed to spend that money. And the state has an obligation, regardless, to remit that money to districts.
Mm-hmm.
So if a yield bill doesn't pass, the state still has to send all of that same amount of money to districts, which is why the yield bill is so controversial this year, is because that was a lot of money that was needed to send to districts.
Mm-hmm.
And then the default rates would mean that the non-homestead rate, which is rental properties, commercial properties, farms, that would have, the governor's veto would have created a situation where that would have increased by 30% over last year.
Mm.
And we would have had a $60 million, somewhere between $60 and $90 million deficit in the education fund.
Uh-huh.
Running deficit spending, running at a deficit is considered like the absolute worst thing we can do in the eyes of like national and global economic eyes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's not just like it's not like we're just like scolded, and it's not just like sort of the nonsense of watching the stock market and thinking it makes a difference for people's lives. There are real world implications to having our bond ratings downgraded.
Right.
And that's what would have happened. And we have the assurance of bond rating agencies about some of these implications. If our bond ratings are downgraded, that makes all borrowing significantly more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means is the state's dollars can't go as far. So our existing budget that the governor signed into law would not have covered what it was supposed to cover.
Mm-hmm.
All of the new housing projects happening all over the state would have become immediately more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Our ability to create new housing would have become immediately significantly more expensive. School districts who borrow regularly in order to sort of get through the school year, they borrow and then they receive money. They're just a lot of like large institutions are in a regular borrowing cycle. That would have become significantly more expensive. And so it would have basically like tanked any large projects anywhere in the state from across public and private sectors, because very few large private sector projects happen without public sector bonding of some kind.
Right.
And so that would have been very bad for Vermonters.
Mm-hmm. And we should just note that Vermont's bond rating right now is actually fairly good.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I think our previous state treasurer was very proud of.
It's something that our previous treasurer, Beth Pierce, was very proud of, and something that our current treasurer, Mike Pichek, works very hard at. It is, given how small a state we are, we have very little wiggle room. And so that, especially given some of our demographic realities that are harder to change, anything that we do have power on that affects our bond rating is particularly important because we need our limited dollars to go further.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for breaking that down, Emily.
So dorky,
yeah, what are you? Stuff. What's that?
It's like so in the weeds and it sounds so abstract. Like I think before I was in the position I'm in, I would have heard a politician talking about like risking our bond rating and been like, F you, politician, I have to pay my bills today, right? Like I understand how absurd it sounds for me to be like, no, I can't lower your tax rate because of the bond rating. Like I think even in my first year in the legislature, I would have been like, that is ridiculous. What about people's lives? But that is what governing is supposed to be. It's about like making responsible choices for the moment and for the future. And that's what I see the governor not doing in this veto.
Right. Well, that brings me kind of to the question I first started to ask was, what are you sitting with now? Because I think for a lot of people, H887 particularly has raised a lot of fear and a lot of red flags about taxes going up, about affordability, um, and making a lot of people who are struggling financially feel even worse. So what are you sitting with around that right now? Because in some ways it feels like there was no good solution. And so this was kind of the best one the legislature could come up with. And I'm not trying to diss the legislature.
No,
It,
no.
it was a bad situation, and I don't know that anyone was going to be happy with solutions. So I guess, what do people need to know now about this going forward, H887?
It's a terrible situation. It's a terrible bill. And there wasn't and isn't a better solution or a better bill. We spent 5 months doing pretty much nothing but this. We worked very closely with experts in the administration, almost up to the bitter end when they bailed for the sake of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be really, really hard for Vermonters to withstand these tax rates. Like that is absolutely the reality. And I feel terrible about it. Like I ran for office because I want to fix things and I want things to work for people. And I particularly want people to be able to pay their bills. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just like that is my top priority is I just want people to be able to pay their bills. And this makes that harder. And that feels like terrible. Um, I and sort of like in the debate on the House floor or like when talking, when writing something about this, the usual tone around a bill's passing is one of, like persuasion and excitement and highlighting the good aspects of something. And so it's been really interesting to sort of balance that rhetoric, because the bill needs to pass, because we need to fund our schools and like, I care about our teachers and our kids, and I want them to have good schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I know with the fact that like this is going to be really hard, and that's just real. And it's been interesting in the face of the governor's rhetoric and like statewide Republican organizing against school budgets, coordinated statewide organizing against school budgets. And if folks want to know more about that, Allison Novak at 7days wrote a really solid article about that.
Mm-hmm.
In the face of that, the whole debate, the whole conversation has become one like either you care about kids in schools or you care about taxpayers. I care about both. And at the end of the day, like we all have an obligation to fund the schools. That's what we all agreed to. That's how the system works. That's how the statute works. And the governor has been like, I have enabled the governor to take the easy way out in that he can just veto, say, no, I don't like this, and not actually offer another solution that works.
Mm-hmm.
Like for all of his talking points about I came to the table and worked with the legislature, like the bare bones of suggestions that he offered, the numbers don't add up. And it was bare bones. Like it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just politics, and the worst kind of politics in the face of like a fiscal crisis that's facing like one of our most important and vulnerable institutions.
Yeah.
And I hate that.
Yes. And unfortunately, this is my opinion. One thing that makes our school funding so knotted and like knotted in a rope sense, um, is it's not a new problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've been struggling for a while on how to provide equitable education and also pay for it. And this is not new. And like I think you said in one of our earlier conversations on this, you outlined the perfect storm of all the things that came together to raise this tax rate in the first place. And it's messy.
Mhm.
I know we're going into a new biennium.
Wait, before
And
we get to that,
yes.
before we get to the new biennium, I just want to name, so that perfect storm, I think it's helpful to outline it for people who maybe have not listened to the last 4 episodes about this, right? And so the perfect storm is in this single year, health insurance premiums went up significantly, staffing salaries went up significantly in sort of the aftermath of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Old-fashioned inflation for like costs of supplies. Fuel costs went up significantly. Schools are buildings that need to be heated.
Mm-hmm.
Supply costs went up significantly. Sorry, I said supply costs. Deferred maintenance on school buildings
Yep.
had sort of like a crashing impact this year. And then the needs of our students in the aftermath of the pandemic have jumped significantly. And
Yeah.
with that, we have lost significant federal funding that was covering those needs. And so all of that happened in a single year, that caused this. All of that happening in a single year is happening all over the country. We are not the only state grappling with a fiscal crisis in our schools and in our property taxes.
Right. Thank you for that outline. So what I was saying is, I know we're going into a new biennium and an election, so we don't necessarily know what the legislature will look like in come January. However, have the sitting lawmakers had any conversations about, okay, we got through this with 887, but next steps are blah blah blah.
Yeah. So the bill actually contains all of those next steps.
Okay.
Which is very unusual. So usually the yield bill, which we pass every year because this is how we fund our schools, and every year the property taxes change in relationship to how much schools need, par for the course. This year the bill was dozens of pages long. Usually it's 1 page.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually one of the shortest, simplest bills of the year. And it outlines a path going forward. And many of the suggestions that we grappled with throughout the session and many of the solutions that the governor sort of offered at the final hour, along with his veto message, would have made things easier this year and significantly harder next year.
Right.
They were like profound kicking the can. They were kicking the thing that's too large to kick because it would have hurt your toe. I don't have the right metaphor for this situation.
They were trying to kick a dump truck down the road.
Yes, and thank you. And so we were, part of this is knowing and acknowledging that this is really hard for Vermonters this year. And we don't want to make it even harder for Vermonters next year with the solutions we come up with this year, even though it might be politically expedient in an election year. And so frankly, I'm like kind of proud of my colleagues for not making the easy political decision that would have made actual lives harder. So that's good. So what next year in the year out looks like? So we set up a commission to look at the future of education in Vermont. And concurrent to that, we actually have a school construction task force as well.
Oh, good.
Now, what that looks like is we've been having conversations in the legislature about what's next. Is what's next closing smaller schools in order to save costs? Is what's next taking some control of school budgets from districts and moving that to the state level in order to create more equity between districts and maybe reduce some spending? Is the next step to make sure that what's happening in each district is effective as possible, so we're spending less money on special education. All of those things that I just named are like political third rails and are not going to work unless communities really buy into them.
Yeah.
And so we could make those decisions that we're going to close any school with less than 100 students. Um, and then the question is, do they join the elementary school next to them, or do they tuition for elementary
Mhm.
school?
Mhm.
And in doing that, we could have seen, as we have seen before, lots of legislators then lose their seats. And people can make hard political decisions and lose their seats. That's a fine thing. That's part of democracy. But if that means then the schools are not going to get closed, we still haven't saved costs, right?
Mhm.
Do we move to an entirely income-based system of education funding? We've talked about that on the show.
Right.
If we do that, what does that mean given our rapidly aging demographic where most folks' incomes drop significantly when they turn 65?
Mhm.
Is that going to mean that our entire property tax burden, education tax burden sits on folks, from 30 to 65 who are already quite strapped?
Mhm.
So all of those questions are, I mean, I could answer them tomorrow based on like my opinion. All of them would likely get us out of this situation we're in to some
Mhm.
degree. And none of them can be done without communities consenting. And so as we were working on this bill, I would receive emails from all over the state saying things like, you have to lower our property taxes, the spending is out of control. And then in the next paragraph, talk about how important it was that their small local elementary schools stay open.
Mhm.
And so the sort of political and functional reality of this, it's really important that it's collaborative and it's really important that it's transparent. And so the sort of ongoing technical thinking is going to happen about, if we were going to move to funding our schools in a way that's similar to what almost every other state in the country does, which is sort of a payment per student from the state,
Mhm.
what those numbers should look like. That can happen in the background quite easily with paid staff, but and technical expertise, but the community conversations are real and they need to actually happen between now and January for us to be able to do our work when we come back. We
Mhm.
have very clear recommendations that are required of the task force when they come back. Um, and the work to get there is going to be pretty hard, and it's going to need to be like really everyone showing up to talk about it.
Mhm.
So I am hopeful about that. I'm hopeful that I think sometimes we create a task force to kick the can. I think we actually created this in order to have a deliberative, open, community-led process. And so I feel
Mhm.
good about that. Um, and the work is so far from done.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Emily. I have a lot of hopes for this task force, because in part, and I know we have to go to break, but I will try to say this quickly. You outlined all the conundrums and the almost paradoxes in trying to solve the education funding equation, because on the one hand, yes, save a lot of money by closing an elementary school. On the other hand, a community loses one of its third places, where it can
Yes.
grow community. And so these are not simple uh, questions that are being asked. And so I have a lot of hopes for this commission that they can really balance that community emotions, community needs with like data and numbers and that type of thing, and find something that meets in the middle.
I also want to, that sort of third space idea, I just want to respond to it like as you brought it up, because I think it's a really important one. For a very long time in Vermont, the local public school has been the source of sort of like community connection. It's
Mm-hmm.
where people meet, all of those things. And when people talk about closing it, the same number of people talk about sort of the impact on students as talk about exactly what you described. Um, the building doesn't have to be torn down.
True.
And it's given how few elementary school students we have in many of these towns, I don't know if it's kind to those 7 students to put the entire burden of social connection of a community on them, right? Or even on their parents.
Mhm.
And so what does it like? We are at a generational change point in Vermont. And so what does it take to even think about like what should the third space in a community be for? How is it held? What does it look like? We have these great historic preservation grants. Like if you look at the Grange in Guilford and what it was
Mhm.
able to do, that's the center of community there now. It's not the elementary school, though. They
Right.
still have an elementary school, right?
Mhm.
Um, Early care and education can happen on a much smaller scale in one of those places. So it could be for early care and education and seniors and some, just sort of general space. So that's sort of like I think we have to think beyond some of these boxes that we've been living in if we are going to be able to change things and make Vermont a place that like is affordable and works for people.
Thank you. Well,
Mhm.
we are over time and have
Oh,
to
over
hear
time,
from
sorry.
some. That's okay. It's good conversations, right? So we're going to hear from some underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. We will be right back. Welcome back, beautiful people, to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host and producer of the show, and if you're just joining us, I am speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser about the veto override session that just happened in Montpelier. And in the first half of the show, we really dug into particularly the yield bill. And in the second section, we are going to be talking a little bit about social media. So before we dive into that, though, I need to thank BCTV for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with stations around the state. And Emily, what do you need to remind listeners of?
Olga, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station, platform, employer, nor friend of those speaking.
Why? Thank you.
Quite welcome.
So I don't know about you, Emily. Actually, you probably have been paying more attention to some of the public conversations that have been happening around the veto override session more than I have. But I was on the governor's Facebook page this morning, just looking at some of the way he's framing the session and people's responses. And I what struck me is one, the governor very carefully crafted his point of view, agree with it or not. But what I really heard in a lot of the comments was really genuine fear from commenters, at least those who commented about, how am I going to pay my taxes? How am I
Mhm.
going to buy groceries if costs just keep going up? Now, you and I have talked often about affordability and wages and how it feels like the wages in Vermont are just not keeping up with the cost of living. But for a lot of people, in some ways, it doesn't matter. If they're struggling, right?
Mhm.
And I was feeling that, at least on the governor's Facebook page, that those fears were not really being answered. And so I don't know. I feel that's still kind of sitting out there, that a lot of people are just still scared about how they're going to pay for life in Vermont. Um, is that a conversation you've been having with people, or are there other conversations that have been happening?
Yeah. So we just had this brief but pretty complex conversation, you and I, right? Um, about all of the pieces of this.
Mhm.
And what the governor and some of his allies, cronies, whatever we want to call them, um, have done in response to all of that complexity is to essentially like rile up their base with
Mm,
fear. Um, when the reality is that one of the governor's proposals, 11th hour post veto proposal, was to actually remove the changes we made to the property tax credit and income adjustment to the yield bill in order to save money.
mhm.
which would have meant that all of those folks who are commenting there, who are scared because their property tax bills are real and large, would not get the kind of income adjustment that's going to be needed this year and the kind of
Right.
property tax that's needed this year. Because the majority of Vermonters who pay property taxes pay it based on their income, not based on the value. Like it's a combination of their income and the value of their
Right.
property, right?
Right.
And the governor's proposal left all of those folks out high and dry. Normal times, we have a year delay, and these times they didn't. And so the policy work that it takes to lower costs for Vermonters to make Vermont affordable are more complicated, right? Like Vermont's not unaffordable because people have to pay an extra $10 when they renew their license. Vermont is unaffordable because our wages are low and our health insurance costs are high and our childcare costs are high and our elder care costs are high. And our wages, again, are trapped because businesses don't have the infrastructure and physical and social that they need to expand and grow and pay more. And so, but that nuance is gone when all that happens is the governor riles up the base by saying, those Democrats made your lives less affordable. And I lost fighting for you. When the majority of the bills that we passed are actually about reducing costs for Vermonters, right? Like we did significant healthcare reform this year that lowered costs for Vermonters. When we increased money going to the DMV, it's so that we can pave the road so people get less flat tires. Like the reality of what it looks like is gone. And then people's fear, especially on social media, is totally triggered. And people behave in terrible, terrible ways. And I just want to, like, in the aftermath of all of this, the governor essentially having a temper tantrum on social media because we overrode his vetoes. His vetoes that he did not have to use. You know, he vetoes more things than any governor ever has. After not actually coming to the table. Like, quite literally, he was supposed to come to a meeting about the bill and didn't show up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, and he has said in previous releases that he uses the veto as a tool to kind of push the legislature in the direction he wants to go, which I think most people would agree is not really how a veto is supposed to be used.
No, it's a blunt force. And the threat of a veto, sure. An actual veto, too late. Too late.
Yeah, too late.
So he's riling up the base. Legislators are getting death threats. Social, like the behavior on social media where small pieces, like a single sentence, is clipped from a much larger, more nuanced statement about, say, property taxes, is taken out of context. And then people are like scared. And so they're cruel, right? Because it feels like no one's listening to them. It's really hard to listen to other people on social media. I think, like, we have long acknowledged that the algorithm is designed to breed that kind of fear.
And not really allow nuance.
What?
And not really allow nuance. Yeah.
I mean, one of the bills he vetoed was actually going to, like, regulate all of that, right? That's what part of the data privacy bill does. So, like, that's kind of extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to go from here, but I'll say that yesterday, in the midst of sort of talking to my colleagues and helping them think about how to navigate some of the social media storm, how to exactly, as you said, Olga, like, acknowledge people's fears as real and this time as difficult. How to do all of that, I got an email from Compassionate Brattleboro, which is a really great group of folks who are sort of working to make Brattleboro a more compassionate place. And they wanted to hold up Brattleboro and Vermont as a paragon of, like, civic discourse in the lead up to Election Day. And I've often said that the State House has a degree of civility and open collaborative work that I don't think we see in Washington or other places. And
Hmm.
I treasure that.
I think that's
And
fair.
it is fair. And this year, the governor's rhetoric has really gone into overdrive. Um, the numbers he's using are inaccurate, in addition to sort of the angle. Um,
Hmm.
and it's not good for anyone, and it's not good for our communities. And that is then being sort of repeated in our local elections and our local community chats. And I'm not sure where we go from here, but it feels like we're spiraling down, and I'm scared about it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I was reading through his transcript from the I think it was the press conference he gave on Wednesday, and just looking at how he was framing things, and I feel your assessment is pretty spot on. Um, and he made his pitch with the elections coming to basically say, we need more balance in Montpelier, and we need people who put communities over party politics, uh, which I thought was very much on the nose for a pre-election statement. I guess what I find interesting. We try to talk on this show about the stories we tell ourselves, and how those stories can do create policy or feed into policy, and sometimes the stories are accurate and sometimes they aren't, um, or part of the story
Mhm.
might be accurate and other parts of the story are not. And I feel that on social media that is just blown up 1,000 times. But one thing I've been sitting with lately, it's a little bit of a right angle turn, but like when we were talking earlier in the year about the 3% surcharge on incomes above 500,000,
Mhm.
a lot of, again, unscientific poll, people in my circle absolutely lost their minds. And when I asked them quite point blank, I'm like, oh, do you earn $500,000 more or more a year? And no, nowhere close. And I said, so why do you think this bill's going to affect you? And I think what was interesting was I usually got a combination of two answers. One was, well, I'm already struggling, and so anything that touches taxes is eventually going to impact me. Like, it's all knock-on effects. I'm going to get it, in the backside one way or the other. Um, which to me is a story of really feeling kind of let down by at least the
Mhm.
financial system. The second one was, and I love our American optimism here, um, was along the lines of, yeah, but I might earn 500,000 someday, so therefore I have to protect what
Mhm.
might possibly be future money. Um, and I thought, well, I love how you're thinking. It would be wonderful, yes, but given the financial realities, is it likely going to happen? More than likely not, in at least these folks' lives. But I just found that kind of, these two stories butting heads around taxes and having to protect your money and your finances just really fascinating. I don't really
Mhm.
know what to do with it, but I find it fascinating, and I feel it's fueling some of these conversations, um, in ways that we may not see. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I think so. The reality is we have to do something about taxes,
Mhm.
right? They're how we pay for these services that I think everyone actually, for the most part, like 99% of Vermonters want these services, want public schools, want these things.
Mhm.
And so we have to do something about taxes. And right now, those taxes are sitting unfairly on likely the exact people you describe, right? On
Yeah.
sort of like your middle class. um, working class folks. And so we have to do something about taxes. The thing that we can do about taxes is to increase taxes on the 1% on multinational corporations in order to make things easier for the rest of us. But when we're scared, all of the rhetoric collapses.
Mm-hmm.
And people think that when I'm talking about these taxes on the 1%, I must be saying all taxes are good, these property taxes are good. Instead of,
Mm-hmm.
I think these property taxes are a catastrophe, and I'm doing everything I can to change them. And one of the ways we can change them is to make sure that folks are paying their fair share, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's, again, a level of nuance that gets collapsed when we're scared.
Yeah.
I got an email from a constituent saying, I really hope I someday make enough money to pay this tax, the 500,000 tax. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, I do too. I hope that for me. I'm confident it's never going to happen, given my, like, always working with the government career track here. But like, once you do make that much money, like, how much more do you need, really? Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
some, but like, I think people who make much less money than that, and I am very much included in that. Um, I don't think I can fathom what it would be like to make that much money and then pay taxes on it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to have, $1,000 a month be a rounding error in my life. Like, I can't really fathom what that would feel like.
Mm-mm. No, no. Me either. Although, like your constituent, it would be fun to find out.
Mhm.
um, I'm starting to feel I that we need to perhaps have some more. It feels kind of bougie, but we need to start having more conversations of what a middle class in Vermont looks like.
Mhm.
And as long as we're scared and we're writing scary things on Facebook, I don't know that we can calm ourselves down enough to have, we're kind of in a collective fight or flight when
Mhm.
it comes to our financial lives in this state right now. I think many of us. And, the thing about fight or flight is your frontal lobe, where all your decision making happens, is not happening. Uh, but I think we need to
And
get more frank about what a middle class in Vermont would look like and whether or not we have one,
mhm.
and if it's healthy.
Yeah.
Um,
And the governor's rhetoric, again, is purposefully putting people into fight or flight mode because that rage fuels the kind of election year decisions that he wants.
yeah.
And that is irresponsible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, when I was first running for office, um, and I sort of picked this tagline, committing to community, and people keep on, like, I keep on getting people trying to get me to change that tagline, because it's too soft. But for me, it's about like, it's a real theory of change that most of us are under a level of financial and personal social stress that doesn't make it possible for us to show up in community the way we want to.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to make significant changes to our social infrastructure and our wages in order for us to be able to have the time, the leisure time to
Mm-hmm.
show up for each other in the way that I think most of us want to. And most of us, the reason many of us live in Vermont is because we believe in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard as a person trying to make laws and trying to have an open participatory process to, I send out my newsletter and we do the show and we host community conversations and anyone can come testify who wants to via Zoom anytime. But to get out of your own social and parasocial bubbles to engage that way is a huge leap. It's not a leap I made before I ran for office, you know. And so I don't know what that like, I don't know what that path looks like. I don't know what that conversation looks like where Vermonters talk about like what a healthy middle class feels like and looks like and is shaped like. I just know that our the gap is widening here.
Yeah.
And this cannot, you know, we talk about gentrification in urban areas a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But the divide in the state has always been significant. And perhaps even it's a blip that it chilled out for a bit. But it's, I'm really worried about it. It's my, you know, it's my top worry. And it's one of the, you know,
Yeah.
our socioeconomic diversity is one of the things that makes our community so strong.
Yes. Yeah. And speaking of that, that was one post on the governor's Facebook page I felt very frustrated by was he compared two maps. One was a map showing that Vermont's property home sale prices have gone up. I don't remember what the percentage was, but it's one of the fastest growing in the country. And then he compared it with a map of potential impacts of from the new Act 250 and housing bill, 687, and talked about how this bill could stifle rural development. And I just felt really frustrated because to me those two maps were not working with the same data or talking about the
Mhm.
same things with the same reasons. And so it just felt like 2 plus 2 equals 4, or not 2 plus 2 equals 4, 2 plus 2 equals 5, you know, putting two
Mhm.
things together and getting a different answer.
I really appreciate you saying that because in the last few floor debates we've had and in the rhetoric coming out of his office, it all feels just like wildly disingenuous to me and
Mm,
unmathematical. And I know that like people expect that from politics. I know people expect that from Washington. That's not why I do this, and that's not what my expectations in Vermont are. And it makes it really, our civil society, our functioning of our systems depends on agreeing to some degree of truth. And
yeah.
that is really getting lost lately, and it's very scary.
Hmm.
And I worry that to win and to get the kind of policies that I think Vermonters need, um, I might have to become complicit in that, and I'm not willing to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, that is an uncomfortable place to sit. I can imagine. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I will try to do this conversation as much justice as I can. But my friend Leah McGrath Goodman, who was on the show couple months ago now, she's studying corruption. She's getting a master's degree, and it's focused on corruption, and government corruption is fascinating. And so she and I had a conversation last night, and she was talking about taxes. And I just want to share this. Because I can see a little bit like maybe how this conversation is sort of going this way, even if we're not exactly uh, a carbon copy of the example I'm about to give. So what she's working on now is looking at countries who have really heavy natural resources,
Mhm.
oil, gemstones, something like that, and how when those natural resources are so valuable that the government can rely on them more than they rely on taxes from the electorate, then it actually causes a schism between the government and its electorate or its citizenry, because taxes are usually kind of the contract between governments and their citizens. Governments are like, we need your tax money so we can operate. And citizens are like, well, we're going to pay you our tax money, but we expect schools and roads and clean drinking water and all those things. So it's kind of along with elections, it's the contract
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
binds the two together. And when something gets financial gets in the way of that, it can be a real breakdown. between the citizens and their government. And I was just, when I was going through social media this morning and looking at some of the comments, I know it's not a carbon copy, like Vermont is not relying on oil right now, but it did make me think of like, how are we, like, are we at a place right now where that contract between the government and its citizenry is at least strained? I don't think we're breaking down, but
Oh my God. This is an amazing question. And I just really like Leah so much. And I have lots of things to say about this in an international context. But what I would say in the final 5 minutes in Vermont is one of the challenges of the divided government that we're operating under here in Vermont is that the legislature has a particular theory of change around that contract, right? Which involves a higher level of taxes from those who can most afford it in order to create services for the rest of us. And we have an administration that essentially does not believe in those services for the rest of us. And so the contract is very strained because we're asking people to pay for a level of services that they are often not receiving because the governor is doing everything he can to dissolve, denigrate, wither away those services to slowly, over the last 8 years of his administration, has been doing everything he can to essentially destroy state government. And so we're still asking people to pay, but they're not getting what that contract might result in. And so that, I agree, that is a really
fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very sad. Very frustrating. How do we hold an administration besides voting them out? I know that is one way, but like, how do we get this through to people that this is what's happening?
I mean, it's all happening in the context of a reduction in the fourth estate, as they say, right? And so I think Vermont Digger and VPR does a fairly good job of, holding some degree of light to that.
There are some very hardworking reporters in both those organizations.
And very few Vermonters read Vermont Digger. Most of us read our local papers or Facebook. And so very few people know what's happening there, right? Yeah.
Well, it's a good excuse to come back next week.
It is.
And have another conversation. Emily Kornheiser, so glad you were here. Thank you for breaking down a very complex conversation for us. And yes, everyone, the Montpelier Happy Hour will be back next week with another episode. Emily, in the meantime, if people need to reach out to you or want to follow your newsletter, how can they do that?
I would love to talk to any and all people. It is election season here in all of Vermont. And folks can go to my website and you'll find contact information. There might be a house party near you you can come to. I might be knocking on your door soon, or just be in touch via email or phone.
And as always, if you want to drop us a line here at the Montpelier Happy Hour, it's the montpelierhappyhour@gmail.com. Hey, everybody, take care. Have a good weekend.